The first light of dawn crawled slowly over the trenches of Veros Theta, revealing a world that looked more like a graveyard than a battlefield. The sky, once blue, had become a permanent bruise of smoke and drifting ash. Shell craters stretched like open wounds across the landscape. Burned-out tanks lay half-buried in the mud, and among them, the silhouettes of countless soldiers, men and women of the Astra Militarum, standing like fragile pillars against an endless storm. Yet in that quiet moment before orders, before artillery, before death roared awake once more, there was stillness. A strange, heavy stillness that made the air hum. No bolters, no lagoon fire, no screaming Vex channels. Only the soft hiss of wind carrying the smell of burning promethium through the trenches. In that silence, a new regiment arrived. Their boots struck the metal trench plates in a slow, steady rhythm, measured, disciplined, unwavering. They marched not as heroes, but as ordinary humans forced into extraordinary war. Every step felt like a statement carved into the ashes of the world. We are still here. They were not superhuman like Astartes. They were not mechanical like the mechanics. They were not immortal like the neurons. They were not psychic titans like the Thousand Suns. They were simply human, and yet somehow they still stood. At the head of the column marched a young officer with a torn coat, a cracked rebreather mask, and eyes darkened by months of relentless fighting. His name did not matter to most, but to those in his regiment he was a lifeline. A quiet force who never raised his voice, never showed fear, never stepped back. Behind him, thousands of guardsmen moved as one. Battered armor, patched uniforms, shaking hands gripping lagoons that had overheated too many times. They were exhausted, hungry, and sleepless. Some hadn't spoken in days. Some whispered prayers as they marched. Some whispered names of loved ones. Others whispered nothing at all. And yet, they all marched forward. Word had traveled across the front lines that Veros Theta would fall within days. Chaos war bands had already consumed the outer districts. A tide of cultists, demons, and corrupted machines now pressed in, unstoppable, unending. Entire battalions had been erased from existence. Defense grids had collapsed. Vex towers had melted. The planetary governor was dead. Even the Astartes who had been deployed here had vanished into the swirling maelstrom. All that remained, the last thread keeping the world from the abyss, was the Astra Militarum. Ordinary humans with nothing but lagoons, courage, and an emperor who might or might not be listening. And yet the officer did not falter. As he reached the final defensive trench, he looked up at the sky. Ash rained like black snow. The horizon glowed with the sickly colors of warp fire. The sound of distant chanting echoed from the ruined spires, growing louder with every heartbeat. His regiment fell silent behind him, not out of fear, but out of the solemn understanding that they were about to face the impossible. He stepped onto a broken bunker and addressed them, not with grand speeches or hollow promises, but in a quiet voice that the wind carried across the trenches like a final prayer. You are the line between humanity and the abyss. You are the wall that does not break. You are the Astra Militarum. The soldiers listened, not because he demanded it, but because they needed to. For a moment, they forgot the cold in their bones, the weight of survival, the grief carved into their hearts. They forgot the crushing reality that many of them would not survive the next few hours. They felt something deeper, something ancient, something older than the Imperium itself. The stubborn, unbillable will of humanity. A distant rumble shook the ground. First a tremor, then a growl, then a violent roar as the horizon ignited with warp lightning. Demonic silhouettes emerged like ink spreading through water. Engines screamed. Drums thundered. A tide of chaos surged toward them, filling the world with a monstrous chorus. The final battle of Veros Theta was beginning, but instead of fear, something strange happened in the trenches. Something quiet, something powerful. The guardsmen stood taller. Lagoons lifted in steady hands. Helmets snapped into position. Vex operators whispered final codes. Tank crews sealed their hatches with trembling but determined fingers. The officer's voice returned, still calm, still steady, still human. Hold the line. The words spread through the regiment like fire, soft, glowing, unstoppable. For a moment, they did not feel alone. For a moment, they did not feel weak. For a moment, they believed the impossible could be delayed, defied, and resisted. The first artillery shell flew overhead, screaming like a dying star, illuminating the trenches in a blinding flash. The war had begun, and the Astra Militarism, fragile yet unyielding, stood ready to face it. As the officer lowered his rebreather mask, sealing himself into the storm of chaos, a final thought crossed his mind. Quiet, fragile, painfully human. If we fall today, let our courage be remembered. And as dawn broke fully across the burning world, the Astra Militarism, millions strong, nameless yet eternal, prepared to write another chapter in the impossible saga of humanity's survival. The morning fog had not yet lifted from the shattered plains of Veros Theta when the regiment began their march. Dawn filtered weakly through drifting ash clouds, casting pale beams across the broken earth. Tanks rolled slowly over cracked ferrocene, their engines coughing smoke. Infantry squads walked behind them in deliberate, tired steps, their uniforms torn and their armor marked with months of relentless combat. There was no victory in their stride, only duty, only endurance, only the quiet acceptance that they were needed once more. They were ordinary humans in every sense, some barely adults, some old enough to carry decades of scars. Some carried keepsakes hidden beneath their armor, a bracelet, a name etched into metal, a faded photograph. Some carried nothing but their lagoon and the last remnants of their hope. And yet they all marched as one, united in the simple truth that the Imperium needed them. If they faltered, a world would fall. The officer at their head walked with a steady, unhurried pace. Not heroic, not dramatic, just steady. His coat fluttered gently in the rising wind, and his rebreather mask hung at his side. He watched the path ahead with clear, disciplined eyes that had long forgotten how to blink at horrors. His hands were cold, but his resolve was not. He had buried too many soldiers to ever consider retreat. He had carried too many wounded to ever think of surrender. He walked because stopping was not an option. To his right marched the Vex operator, helmet dented, antenna cracked, one eye bruised from shrapnel, but still carrying the regiment's only working transmitter. The device crackled occasionally with static or distant screams from other battalions, but the operator ignored them. He clutched the Vex like a lifeline, the final thread tying their regiment to the wider war effort. Behind them, the foot soldiers moved quietly. Their boots sank into the mud. Their breaths misted the cold air. Some whispered small prayers to the Emperor, touching Aquilas carved into their armor. Others simply walked in silence, lost in their thoughts. They had no idea what awaited them beyond the ridge. They only knew that command had ordered a push toward the eastern defensive lines, what remained of them, at least. Faint thunder grumbled in the distance. Not weather, artillery. The war never truly slept on Veros Theta. It only paused long enough for soldiers to fear its return. A veteran sergeant, his face lined like cracked stone, walked beside the officer. "They won't be ready for another push," he muttered quietly. The officer didn't break stride. "They don't have to be ready," he replied. "They just have to walk." The sergeant nodded, saying nothing more. Both men understood the truth. The Astra Militarism did not win wars through overwhelming strength or godlike warriors. They won them because they kept walking. No matter how many fell, no matter how hopeless the battle seemed, another squad would step forward. Another regiment would arrive. Another wave of humanity would take the place of those who were lost. It was not glory. It was not triumph. It was survival. As the regiment moved, hints of the battlefield stretched across the horizon. Twisted ruins, smoke columns rising from burning settlements, hulks of downed aircraft half buried in the dirt. The air tasted of metal and dust. Shadows flickered in the distant ruins. Cultists, demons, or just illusions brought on by exhaustion. It didn't matter. The regiment had seen enough nightmares to walk on without trembling. They reached a long ditch carved by past bombardments. The officer halted, raising a hand. The regiment stopped instantly. Silence fell. Even the tanks seemed to hold their breath. Across the ridge, the remains of an imperial settlement lay half-collapsed. The once busy streets were now blackened trenches. Each building was a broken skeleton. The officer stepped forward, scanning the terrain with a sight that could identify danger even in dead ground. Something moved in the ruins. A faint ripple, a shifting shape. Perhaps an enemy scout. Perhaps just wind stirring dust around broken walls. The officer watched for several long seconds, then lowered his hand. "We proceed," he said softly. The soldiers obeyed without hesitation. As they moved down into the ditch, the wind carried faint echoes, distant voices, chanting rhythmic and wrong, heretical verses drifting through the ruins. The chanting rose and fell like a tide, sometimes disappearing entirely, sometimes bursting into fevered crescendos. The guardsmen tightened their grips on their lagoons. But no one panicked. They had marched toward worse sounds before. At the center of the formation, a young medic carried her satchel close to her chest. Each vial clinked softly with her movements. She had changed more bandages than she could remember. She had seen more fear in the eyes of dying men than she ever wanted to, but she still walked. She still hoped, in her own quiet way, that her presence made a difference. The officer glanced back at his soldiers as they climbed the next ridge. Each man and woman was different pasts, different worlds, different strengths and fears. Yet here in the heart of war, they were the same, a single human wall against the darkness, a final barrier between life and oblivion. As they reached the top of the rise, the full battlefield revealed itself. Smoke pillars spiraled upward, sheets of burning wreckage drifted across the plains. The skeletal frames of abandoned tanks stretched like grave markers. And far ahead, a faint glimmer of defensive energy shields flickered, a fragile line of Imperial resistance barely holding its shape. The officer exhaled slowly. That is our destination. The regiment stared at the distant lights, tiny, trembling, and almost lost in the vastness of destruction. The sergeant spoke quietly. "Think they're still alive down there?" The officer's voice was steady. "If they are not, we will stand in their place." And so the Astra Militarum marched onward, fragile yet unbreakable, carrying not just weapons and armor, but the stubborn belief that humanity was worth saving. They walked with fear in their hearts but courage in their steps, facing a world determined to erase them. Because this was what it meant to be a guardsman, to stand where no one else could, to fight without expectation of glory, to endure long after hope should have died. And as the regiment descended toward the burning horizon, they carried with them the quiet truth that defined their existence. We are the line. We do not break. The horizon was no longer a distant promise, but a burning, trembling reality. Varos Theta's eastern defensive line, a fragile knot of ruined barricades and scorched earth, waited for the Astra Militarum to arrive, or to be consumed by the approaching darkness. Artillery fire drummed endlessly in the distance, shaking the ground, sending tremors through the boots and armor of the marching soldiers. Shells tore the air apart, leaving trails of fire and ash. The regiment advanced in disciplined formation, moving like a tide of ordinary humans against an extraordinary apocalypse. Their movements were precise, their breaths synchronized with the pulse of the battlefield, every step deliberate despite exhaustion. Some carried the dead weight of grief. The faces of fallen comrades burned into their memory, but they pressed forward regardless. The officer, still at the front, scanned the battlefield with unwavering eyes. His gaze was unflinching, cataloging threats, calculating paths, noting every shadow, every crater, and every ripple in the smoke. He had learned long ago that hesitation was a luxury soldiers of the Astra Militarum could never afford. Every second lost could mean death for hundreds. A sudden explosion tore the air nearby, showering mud and debris over a squad of infantry. They rose quickly, shaking themselves free, bolters and lagoons ready. No words were spoken, no hesitation, only action. That was the rhythm of survival here. React, adapt, and continue. The regiment moved as if guided by instinct and faith alone, every member understanding their role without the need for speeches or orders. The distant silhouette of a war-torn city rose from the haze. Once bustling, now a maze of crumbling towers and fire-scorched streets, it was a nest of chaos forces, cultists, mutants, and twisted machines. Whispers of warp energy flickered through the air, a faint distortion that made the hairs on the back of the soldiers' necks rise. Yet still, the regiment marched forward, eyes set, hands steady, hearts filled with stubborn determination. The medic moved among the troops, tending to scrapes, burns, and exhaustion, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. She had no illusions of safety, no dreams of glory, yet she persisted, a quiet force keeping hope alive in small, human ways, bandaging a torn sleeve, adjusting a broken respirator, whispering a soft prayer for strength. Each life she touched became a thread in the fragile tapestry of survival, a tether to something greater than fear or death. The officer halted at the crest of a cratered ridge, surveying the incoming battle. The chaos forces were advancing, slow but relentless, their movements unpredictable, almost animalistic in their aggression. The regiment lowered themselves into firing positions, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. The officer whispered to no one in particular, "Hold steady, I'm true. For humanity." Bolter fire erupted, lagoons flared, and the battlefield ignited with controlled chaos. Soldiers fell. Cries of pain rose above the roar of artillery, but the regiment held its line. Each lagoon bolt, each disciplined volley, pushed back the shadow tide. Their courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, the will to stand when every instinct screamed to flee. In the distance, a colossal demon manifested briefly, shimmering in warp energy before vanishing into the smoke. A veteran guardsman raised his lagoon with shaking hands. The officer's voice cut through the panic, calm and commanding. "Do not falter. The Emperor guides our aim." The regiment fired again, synchronized, relentless. Some shots struck their target, some did not. Yet every soldier understood a deeper truth. They were not here for glory, nor for personal survival. They were here because someone had to stand, someone had to resist, and someone had to fight so that humanity might endure. Hours passed. The regiment pushed forward through fire and rubble, dragging wounded comrades along, supporting each other through exhaustion, fear, and despair. Tanks advanced ahead, their guns roaring, clearing paths, suppressing enemy fire. Smoke, dust, and flame obscured everything. Yet still, the Astra Militarum pressed forward. At the edge of the burning city, the officer raised his hand again, signaling a halt. Ahead, a ruined fortress marked the final objective. Cultist banners fluttered in the polluted wind. Warp distortions shimmered around the gates. The enemy was concentrated here, and the battle would reach its fiercest point. The soldiers took a moment to breathe, to gather strength, to steel themselves for what was coming. There were no speeches, no promises of survival, only quiet acknowledgement. only understanding that every step forward was a victory in itself. Every breath, every heartbeat, every moment alive was a triumph against an unrelenting tide of chaos. The officer looked out over the battlefield, armor scorched, mask scratched, eyes burning with determination. Around him, ordinary humans, the backbone of the Imperium, prepared for the impossible. They were weary, they were afraid, they were fragile, and yet they were unbreakable. As the sun rose higher, casting its first full light over the blackened earth, the officer raised his chainsword in salute, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of resolve. Around him, the regiment echoed the gesture, a silent, unbroken chorus of humanity standing against the storm. And in that moment, even as the first volleys of the enemy surged toward them, the unspoken truth resonated through every soldier. They might fall, they might bleed, they might die, but they would hold the line. Always, the city awaited, the enemy awaited, and the Astra Militarism advanced, human, fragile, and yet unyielding. The regiment reached the outer walls of the ruined fortress, a blackened skeleton of stone and steel. Firelight flickered across twisted banners, marking the territory of the cultists who had claimed it as their own. The air was thick with smoke, ash, and the acrid stench of burning promethium. Somewhere deep within, the warp roared, a pulse of raw, chaotic energy that made the very earth tremble beneath their feet. The officer stood at the head of the regiment, scanning the shattered gates. His hand rested on his lost pistol, fingers brushing the worn metal. He inhaled the smoke-filled air, steadying himself and his men. The soldiers around him were silent, tense, every heartbeat magnified in the stillness before the storm. Every man and woman knew what awaited them beyond those gates, and yet no one faltered. The first explosion shook the ground as a cultist demolition charge ignited along the fortress walls. Smoke and shards of masonry filled the air. The officer's voice cut through the chaos, calm and measured. Advance. No hesitation. Lagoons erupted in unison, a controlled storm of fire that shredded the shadowed corridors of the enemy. The regiment moved forward, methodical, each step measured. Ordinary humans, fragile, fallible, were becoming a single, unstoppable wave. Fear was present, yes, but it was tempered by discipline and faith. A demon emerged from the wreckage, a twisted form of clawed limbs and corrupted flesh. It howled as lagoon fire tore across its warped body, bolts burning through corrupted muscle and armor. The squad beside the officer fell back, wounded yet still firing. The officer raised his voice. "Keep moving. Do not give them ground." The soldiers obeyed without hesitation, dragging the wounded, covering each other with suppressive fire, advancing into the very Maw of Chaos. Each corridor they entered was a gauntlet, twisted by warp energies, littered with traps, corpses, and the stench of decay. Every step forward was a battle, every breath a triumph against fear. In the center of the formation, the medic moved with quiet determination. Her hands were steady, despite the chaos surrounding her. A wounded guardsman cried out, clutching a burn across his chest. She applied her field dressing with practiced precision, whispering words of comfort that no one else could hear over the roar of the battle. Each life she preserved was a thread in the fragile line holding back annihilation. The officer led the regiment deeper into the fortress, past shattered barricades and smoldering ruins. Cultists fell before them, sometimes screaming, sometimes chanting. Warp distortions warped the air, bending light and sound, but the regiment adapted. Every man and woman trusted the officer's gaze, the rhythm of the squad, and the unspoken cohesion that had been forged through weeks of relentless combat. A sudden eruption tore through the ceiling above, a burst of psychic energy, bright as lightning, throwing soldiers to the ground. The officer steadied himself, raising his lost pistol. He counted silently. Everyone was still alive. Not all were unscathed, but they had survived. He knew that every second gained, every inch taken was vital. Every step forward kept the tide at bay. The regiment reached the main courtyard of the fortress. Shadows clung to the walls, writhing, unnatural. Figures moved within the smoke, some human, some no longer. The Chaos forces had gathered their strength for a counterattack. The officer gestured forward. "Brace yourselves. Hold the line. Fire as one." The soldiers obeyed instantly. Bolters roared. Lagoons flared. Smoke and fire filled the courtyard as human courage collided with inhuman horror. Tanks rolled in, crushing debris and enemy alike. Soldiers climbed atop wreckage, firing down from elevated positions. Chaos fell upon them in waves, but the regiment held. They did not charge recklessly. They did not retreat. They endured. Time became a blur. Minutes stretched into hours. The officer felt exhaustion gnaw at his bones, but he did not stop. Every move, every order, every glance counted. The survival of his regiment, and perhaps of the world, depended on precision, faith, and unbreakable resolve. Then, through the smoke, the officer saw it. The cultist commander, a twisted figure of shadow and flame, standing upon the highest tower, calling upon the warp. Its voice carried through the courtyard, a song of death and corruption. The officer clenched his jaw. "We end this," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The regiment surged forward, a tide of humanity against the darkness. Lagoon fire tore through corrupted flesh. Bolter rounds hammered metal and bone. The medic ran between squads, her hands steady, saving life after life, each one a small victory against despair. At last, they reached the tower base. Smoke and fire swirled around them. The officer led the charge, stepping over fallen soldiers and shattered barricades. He raised his weapon, sighting the cultist commander. With one coordinated volley, the Astra Militarum struck, a precise human wave of courage and willpower. The commander fell, screaming, as the psychic energy dissipated into the night. The fortress quaked, debris falling, walls trembling. Yet the regiment held. They had survived the Inferno. They had faced the impossible and lived. The officer looked around, breathing heavily. Soldiers were battered, wounded, and exhausted, but they were alive. Together they had turned the tide. The courtyard, once a hell's cape of chaos, was now quiet. Smoke still rose, ash drifted through the air, but the darkness had receded, at least for now. He lowered his lapistol and exhaled, voice calm. "Hold fast. The Emperor has not abandoned us." The Astra Militarism had survived another day, ordinary humans against extraordinary horrors. And though the battle was won, the horizon still held countless threats, waiting, watching, and ready to strike. They would march onward. They would fight, and they would endure, because that was what it meant to be human. The fortress had been secured, but the echoes of battle lingered like ghosts. Smoke drifted lazily through shattered windows, curling around broken beams and scorched walls. The silence was not peace. It was the calm before the next storm. The officer moved through the courtyard, inspecting his regiment. Faces were grim, some smeared with soot, others with blood. Yet in every pair of eyes burned a quiet, unbroken resolve. The medic moved among the squads, tending wounds, her hands steady despite trembling exhaustion. A soldier's arm had been burned, another's leg grazed by shrapnel. Each touch, each patch, each whispered reassurance was a reminder. Survival was fleeting, but it mattered. Humanity clung to life wherever it could. The officer turned to survey the city beyond the fortress walls. Veros Theta lay in ruins. Smoke rose in great columns, and distant fires flickered like dying stars. Shadows moved within the ruins. Loose cultists, lurking demons, warped machines. But the regiment did not hesitate. They were not naive. They knew the battle had not ended. Securing the fortress was merely the first step. He addressed his soldiers quietly, voice steady but filled with authority. "We have taken the ground, but the war is not over. Stay vigilant. Hold the line. Humanity depends on us." The soldiers nodded. No cheers, no dramatic display, just quiet acknowledgement. They had learned long ago that courage did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it persisted through exhaustion, through fear, through hopelessness. In the fortress's command room, the officer examined the Vex transmissions intercepted from the enemy. Cultist communications crackled with static, yet patterns emerged. War bands were regrouping, moving to cut off supply lines to strike at weak points. The officer's jaw tightened. He had anticipated this. Every victory was temporary. Every step forward invited the enemy to adapt. Yet he did not falter. Outside, squads began patrolling the surrounding streets. Lagoons and flammers raised, every movement precise, every step deliberate. Scouts moved ahead to detect ambushes, eyes scanning shadows for unnatural movement. The regiment was a fragile wall, ordinary humans carrying the impossible weight of survival on every shoulder. A distant roar split the air. A demon, massive and twisted, stalking through the ruins. Soldiers froze, hearts pounding, but the officer's voice rang out, calm and commanding. "Engage! Hold nothing back." Lagoons flared, bolters hammered, and the courtyard erupted once more in fire and sound. The demon fell, but not without cost. Several soldiers had been injured, and a medic ran forward to administer aid under heavy fire. The officer surveyed the chaos, noting every detail, every risk, every life that teetered between survival and death. As night fell, a quiet darkness settled over the fortress. Smoke hung low, carrying the metallic scent of war. The regiment huddled in broken buildings, barricaded rooms, and shattered corridors. Fires from distant ruins cast flickering shadows across their faces. They ate little, rested less, but they survived. That alone was victory. The officer walked among them, observing. A young guardsman stared blankly at the wall, trembling. A veteran whispered a prayer for his fallen comrades. The officer did not speak. He simply nodded, a silent affirmation that even in despair, humanity endured. Hours later, a storm rolled over Veros Theta. Rain fell in heavy sheets, mixing with ash and soot, creating rivers of mud through the streets. The regiment moved cautiously, aware that storms could hide dangers as easily as shadows. The officer led, eyes scanning every alley, every doorway, every ruined building. The human heart was resilient, but the enemy was cunning. Every step forward had to be calculated. In the distance, a faint glow pulsed, warp energy, subtle but unmistakable. The officer's hand went to his lost pistol. Something stirred, something ancient and dangerous. The regiment tightened formation, muscles coiled like springs, ready for the unknown. The human wall would not break. Not tonight, not ever. The officer turned to the medic, who had been silently tending to wounded soldiers. Stay alert. This is not over. She nodded, eyes steady despite fatigue. The human spirit could bend, but it would not snap. From the shadows, a low, guttural chant began to rise. A warning or a threat, the officer could not tell. The regiment braced, every lagoon aimed, every flamer primed. The darkness seemed to press closer, aware of the fragile humans standing against it. And yet, despite exhaustion, despite fear, the regiment did not waver. Night deepened, the rain fell harder, and the echoes of war carried across the ruins. Somewhere, the cultists regrouped. Somewhere, demons whispered and plotted. Somewhere, the emperor's will waited silently, a quiet light in the void. And the Astra Militarism, ordinary humans standing against extraordinary darkness, endured. They were battered. They were exhausted. They were fragile. And yet they were unbreakable. Because that was what it meant to be human. Because that was what it meant to be a guardsman. Because they would hold the line. Always. The dawn was gray and heavy, shrouded by clouds that threatened more than rain. The regiment had spent the night in the shattered fortress, tending wounds, reinforcing barricades, and keeping watch over the ruined city. Every breath was measured, every movement careful. Outside, the air was tense, vibrating with the faint hum of machines and the distant echo of enemy activity. The officer stepped onto the parapet, surveying the streets below. Rubble littered every surface. Fires burned sporadically, and the occasional movement suggested that the cultists were not idle. They were regrouping, gathering strength, preparing for a counterattack. The officer's jaw tightened. This was expected. Every victory drew the enemy closer, testing the limits of human endurance and resolve. He turned to the sergeant at his side. "Prepare the squads. Position them along the eastern wall. The first wave will come at first light." The sergeant nodded, moving swiftly to relay orders. Soldiers dispersed, reinforcing positions, checking weapons, and bracing for what was coming. The regiment's ordinary humans were anything but ordinary here. Each one carried exhaustion, fear, and grief. Yet each also carried a fierce, stubborn determination. They had survived the inferno of the previous battle, and now they were ready to meet the next challenge. The first shadows appeared on the horizon, twisted shapes moving with purpose, advancing through the ruins. The officer signaled the squads to hold their fire. Let them come closer. Every shot mattered. Every movement was calculated. The enemy surged forward in chaotic formation. Demons and cultists intermingled, war machines dragging wreckage and flame. The regiment opened fire with devastating precision. Lost guns flared, bolters roared, and every coordinated volley pushed the shadow tide back. Soldiers fell, yes, and screams rose above the roar, but the regiment held. Step by step, they forced the enemy back. A young guardsman froze for a moment as a demon emerged from the smoke, its form towering, claws dripping with warp energy. The officer's voice rang out, calm and commanding. "Do not hesitate. Fire together. Stay in formation." The soldier obeyed, raising his lagoon. The coordinated fire of his squad struck true, and the demon recoiled, wounded but not destroyed. Others fell around it, soldiers pressing the attack, bolters hammering the enemy's advance. Ordinary humans standing against chaos incarnate. The medic darted between squads, moving with a rhythm born of necessity. She applied field dressings, tended to burns and fractures, whispered words of encouragement that no one else could hear. Each life saved was a victory. Each heartbeat preserved a defiance against oblivion. The officer moved along the eastern wall, chain sword in one hand, lost pistol in the other. He noted weak points, repositioned squads, reinforced barricades. His mind was clear, focused. Fear was present, but it was controlled, harnessed. Every second counted. Every decision could tip the balance between survival and annihilation. The enemy's counterattack intensified. Warp energy flared, distorting light and sound, making the very air vibrate with unnatural force. Cultists shrieked as demons surged through the breaches. Soldiers fired relentlessly, every shot a strike against the darkness. The regiment held, step by step, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. A tank rolled forward, its massive cannon unleashing thunderous volleys, clearing corridors and crushing enemy formations. The officer gestured, directing infantry to take cover behind the debris, coordinating their efforts with precision. Every squad understood their role. Every soldier was part of a single, unbroken line of resistance. Hours passed. The regiment fought with endurance that was almost unnatural. Wounds were ignored, exhaustion pushed aside, fear transformed into focus. They fought not for glory, not for personal survival, but for something larger, humanity itself. In the midst of battle, a warp rift opened near the courtyard, shimmering with chaotic energy. Shadows swirled within it, and whispers rose, almost human, almost intelligible. The officer raised his lost pistol, eyes narrowing. Steady, focus. The Emperor guides our aim. The regiment fired in unison, coordinated, disciplined, every shot pushing back the rippling shadow. The rift wavered, destabilized, and eventually collapsed under their unyielding defense. Ordinary humans had endured an unnatural, incomprehensible threat and prevailed. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the burning ruins, the enemy began to retreat. The officer surveyed the battlefield, noting the fallen, the wounded, and the exhausted. Every breath was hard-earned. Every movement required effort, but they had held. The regiment gathered within the fortress, securing barricades, counting the cost of the battle. Faces were pale, bodies battered, yet there was a quiet pride in their endurance. The officer moved among them, speaking quietly to no one in particular. This is only the beginning. Every day will demand more. Every step will be harder. But we endure. Humanity survives because we stand. Always. Night fell, the battlefield now silent except for distant fires and the whisper of wind through the ruins. Soldiers huddled together, sharing warmth, sharing quiet moments of reflection. They were ordinary humans, fragile, fallible, yet unbreakable in their resolve. And in the darkness, the fortress remained their bastion, a single point of light against encroaching shadows. They would wake to fight again, they would endure again, and they would march again, because that was the unyielding truth of the Astra Militarism. They were the line. They did not break. The night was long, black as the void between stars. The fortress, though secure, offered no comfort. Smoke from distant fires drifted through shattered windows, curling around the broken battlements. The regiment rested only briefly, aware that dawn would bring the next wave of battle, the next test of human resolve. Ordinary humans, fragile and weary, were preparing to step into the storm once more. The officer stood on the parapet, gazing at the ruins sprawling beyond the fortress walls. Streets twisted like jagged scars, buildings reduced to rubble, fires burning as if the city itself mourned. Somewhere in the shadows, the cultists and demons stirred, gathering, planning, and waiting. The officer's jaw tightened. Survival demanded action, not hesitation. He addressed the regiment quietly, voice carrying over the damp, smoky air. We move beyond these walls. We take the fight to them. Every step must be deliberate. Every shot must count. We survive because we stand together. Humanity depends on us. The soldiers moved with silent precision. Gear checked, lagoons primed, bolters loaded. Every squad assumed its position, every movement calculated. They were ordinary humans, yes, but in this moment, they became something greater. A singular force of resolve, a wall of flesh and will against the darkness. The first light of dawn touched the horizon, casting gray and gold across the ruins. A distant rumble echoed, signaling the advance of enemy war machines. Cultists emerged from collapsed buildings, twisted faces illuminated by flickering flames. Demons slipped from the shadows, their claws glinting with unnatural light. And still the regiment advanced, every step a defiance of fear. The officer led the way, chain sword in one hand, lost pistol in the other. He moved along the front line, adjusting squads, reinforcing positions, pushing forward into the heart of danger. Every soldier understood his gaze, his gestures, and the unspoken command. Hold steady, move forward, survive. The first encounter came swiftly. A pack of feral cultists charging from the rubble, shrieking, wielding crude weapons and fire. The regiment opened fire, lagoon bolts streaking through smoke and ash. Some fell, others stumbled but pressed on. Bolters hammered, suppressing the enemy, forcing them back. The courtyard became a maelstrom of disciplined firepower and chaotic aggression. Amid the chaos, a demon tore through a squad, its claws rending armor and flesh. A guardsman fell, screaming, but the medic was there instantly, moving under fire to stabilize the wounded. Each life saved was a defiance. Each heartbeat preserved a triumph against despair. The officer signaled a flanking maneuver. Two squads moved around the ruined streets, clearing pockets of resistance. The enemy was relentless, adapting, striking with cunning. Yet the regiment matched them with unbroken focus. Every step forward was earned with sweat and blood. Every breath a victory over fear. A massive shadow emerged from the smoke, a demon of immense size, warping reality around it. Soldiers hesitated, hearts pounding, but the officer's voice cut through the roar of battle. Stand firm. Focus your fire. Lagoons flared. Bolters thundered. Coordinated volleys struck the demon, wounding it, staggering it, yet it pressed forward, relentless. The officer and his squad targeted weak points, exploiting every opening. The creature roared, a sound that shook the air, but the regiment did not falter. Hours stretched into chaos. The regiment advanced slowly, each building cleared, each street secured, each enemy neutralized. They were ordinary humans, yet extraordinary in courage, endurance, and unity. The officer moved along the line, encouraging the exhausted, correcting positions, never faltering, and a living anchor of determination. By midday, the regiment reached the heart of the ruined city. Smoke rose in columns, twisting and curling like serpents. Fires flickered in broken windows. The enemy had retreated to fortified positions, regrouping for a final push. The officers' eyes narrowed. They were not safe yet. The battle was far from over. The regiment paused briefly, gathering strength. Soldiers tended to wounds, adjusted gear, whispered prayers, or quiet encouragement. They had survived the initial assault, but survival here was fragile, temporary. Every soldier understood that the next steps could be their last. From the shadows, Faint whispers of the warp echoed, carrying with them a sense of malevolent intelligence. Cultists stirred, demons prowled, and the air itself seemed to pulse with danger. Yet the regiment did not hesitate. They had endured fire, chaos, and horror. They would endure this too. The officer raised his hand, signaling the advance. "Forward," he said simply. No fanfare, no speeches, just a command, quiet but absolute. And the regiment moved, ordinary humans stepping boldly into extraordinary darkness. The horizon stretched before them, filled with smoke, ruins, and shadows. The enemy awaited, patient and cunning. Yet the Astra Militarism pressed on, unbroken, unwavering, a fragile human wall against the infinite chaos of the galaxy. They would push further. They would fight harder. They would endure longer, because that was what it meant to be human, because that was what it meant to be a guardsman, because they would hold the line. Always. The regiment advanced cautiously through the labyrinthine streets of Veros Theta. Smoke twisted in the early morning light, curling like serpents around the jagged ruins. Every corner, every shattered doorway, every shadow was a potential threat. The officer led from the front, chain sword in one hand, lost pistol in the other, eyes scanning for movement, for danger, for the subtle distortions of the warp that hinted at unnatural presence. The city ahead was more than a ruin, it was a gateway. The cultists had gathered their forces in the central sector, fortifying what remained of an ancient cathedral. Its spires pierced the sky like skeletal fingers, and warp energy pulsed faintly from its apex. The officer recognized the signs immediately. This was no ordinary stronghold. This was a place where the enemy drew strength from the immaterial itself, and ordinary humans would be tested beyond measure. "Steady," he whispered to the squads around him. "We move together, one step at a time. Trust each other. Trust your training." The first skirmish erupted suddenly. From broken alleyways, cultists surged forward, hurling fire and screaming prayers to impossible gods. Bolters cracked, lagoons flared, and the regiment responded as one. Ordinary humans fired with mechanical precision, pushing back the tide, step by step. The officer moved through the chaos, correcting positions, stabilizing squads, guiding wounded soldiers to cover. A massive shadow appeared above the ruins, the first glimpse of a demon lord manifesting in the material world. Its claws dripped with warp energy, and its eyes glowed with malevolence. Soldiers froze, hearts hammering, but the officer's voice cut through. "Do not falter. Aim. Fire together." Lost guns and bolters fired in unison. The demon staggered, but it was relentless. Soldiers fell under its claws, and the medic ran between positions, hands steady despite the danger. Every life saved, every shot fired, every step forward was a defiance against annihilation. The regiment pressed on, entering the cathedral's perimeter. Warp energy distorted light, bending the edges of reality. Ordinary humans were becoming unnatural in their resilience, their courage hardened by necessity. Barricades were reinforced, choke points established, and squads moved with silent understanding. Fear existed, but it was controlled, directed, harnessed into disciplined action. Inside the cathedral courtyard, the enemy had gathered in numbers greater than the regiment could face head-on. Cultists swarmed, demons prowled, and machines of war roared with unholy life. The officer raised his hand, signaling a coordinated strike. Bolters thundered, lagoons flared, and human determination collided with chaos in waves of fire and fury. Hours passed. The regiment pushed deeper into the cathedral's twisted halls, clearing room after room, corridor after corridor. The officer observed every movement, anticipating threats, guiding squads with precision. Ordinary humans faced extraordinary horrors, yet they endured, step by step, breath by breath. A warp rift opened in the cathedral's center, pulsing with raw, unstable energy. Shadows twisted within it, whispering in voices both alien and familiar. Soldiers hesitated, but the officer advanced, raising his chained sword. Forward, no hesitation. Hold the line. The regiment surged, coordinated volleys tearing through the rift's edges, resisting the pull of the warp. The demon lord roared, claws slashing through the air, but ordinary humans pressed forward, a living wall against the impossible. The medic continued her quiet work, stabilizing the wounded, whispering soft encouragements, a beacon of humanity in the overwhelming chaos. Every life she saved, every heartbeat she preserved, strengthened the fragile line holding back the darkness. At last, the officer reached the central altar of the cathedral. The demon lord loomed above, warp energy crackling in the air, reality itself bending and tearing. The officer raised his chained sword, eyes burning with determination. This ends now. For humanity. The regiment fired in perfect unison. Bolters cracked, lagoons flared, and the demon lord faltered. Ordinary humans, fragile, fallible, yet unbreakable, had faced an impossible adversary and had endured. The demon lord screamed, a sound that shook the cathedral and rattled the bones of every soldier. But it began to fade, retreating into the warp as the regiment pressed its advantage. The battlefield quieted, leaving only the echo of victory and the lingering pulse of warp energy, a reminder that the fight was far from over. The officer looked around. Soldiers were battered, wounded, exhausted, yet alive. Every step forward, every life preserved, every shot fired was a testament to human resilience. They had faced the Maw of Chaos and survived. They had endured what should have broken them. Night fell again over Veros Theta. The regiment regrouped, reinforcing positions, tending wounds, and preparing for the next day. The cathedral stood scarred but unbroken, a symbol of resistance. And the Astra Militarum, ordinary humans against extraordinary horrors, remained steadfast. They would continue. They would fight again. They would endure longer, because that was what it meant to be human, because that was what it meant to be a guardsman, because they would hold the line. Always. The ruins of Veros Theta were quiet, deceptively so. The regiment had secured the cathedral and pushed the immediate threat back, but silence in war was rarely peace. The officer knew that chaos often hid in shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Ordinary humans, fragile and mortal, were about to face dangers that could not be seen, only felt. The regiment moved cautiously through the debris-strewn streets, patrolling the area and searching for hidden cultists. The officer led from the front, chain sword in one hand, lost pistol in the other. Every building was a potential trap, every corner a possible ambush. They had survived the Maw of Chaos, but the enemy's cunning was far from spent. "Spread out, but stay within line of sight," he commanded quietly. "Watch the shadows. Trust your instincts." Soldiers nodded, stepping lightly over rubble, eyes sharp. The air was thick with tension, the scent of smoke and ash lingering. Even the wind seemed to whisper warnings through broken windows and shattered walls. The regiment was not merely fighting for survival. They were guarding against the unseen, the insidious, and the treacherous. A faint movement caught the officer's eye, shadow flickering against smoke. He signaled the squad to halt. His lost pistol swept the street, every motion deliberate. The movement resolved into a cultist scout, crouched and observing. The officer gestured sharply. "Engage silently. Take them down before they alert the others." The squad moved with precision, lagoons quiet, and blades swift. The cultist fell without a sound. Yet the officer knew this was only the beginning. The enemy had begun to infiltrate the perimeter, using deception and misdirection. They were not merely a force of brute strength, they were predators in the shadows. The regiment pressed onward, methodically clearing streets and buildings. The officer coordinated with squads to ensure no gap was left unguarded. Ordinary humans were fragile, yes, but they were disciplined, trained, and united. Every step was deliberate, every breath controlled, every heartbeat focused on survival. A sudden explosion echoed from a nearby block. Dust and debris filled the air as a cultist ambush erupted. Ordinary soldiers reacted instantly, bolters and lagoons opening fire with unerring precision. The officer moved into the fray, directing squads, shielding the wounded, ensuring the regiment held formation. From the chaos emerged something unnatural. A warp-twisted creature, humanoid in shape but grotesque, its skin flickering like flame and shadow. Soldiers hesitated for a fraction of a second, but the officer's calm voice cut through. "Hold! Fire together! Do not break!" Coordinated volleys tore through the creature, but it was relentless, a living manifestation of the Immaterium's corruption. Ordinary humans pressed forward, disciplined, relentless, using every strategy and tactic to push it back. The medic moved among them, stabilizing the wounded, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm. Each life she saved, each heartbeat she preserved, was a testament to the regiment's humanity, a defiance against chaos. Hours passed. The regiment navigated the ruined city with meticulous caution, uncovering hidden caches of cultists and warp-corrupted artifacts. The officer made careful decisions, weighing the safety of his soldiers against the strategic necessity of taking control of the city. It was a delicate balance, and every choice carried weight. As night fell, A new threat emerged, warp distortions deep beneath the city. The ground trembled, fissures appearing in streets and walls, whispering unnatural voices. The officer signaled his squad to advance with extreme caution. "This is where they test us," he said quietly. "This is where humanity is measured." The squad moved into the subterranean tunnels, torchlight cutting through smoke and shadows. Every corridor seemed alive, every shadow watching, waiting. The enemy was clever, and the warp itself was a weapon. Ordinary humans, facing forces beyond comprehension, pressed forward anyway. Suddenly, a cultist ambush erupted from the walls above. Soldiers fell, screams echoed, but the regiment did not falter. Lagoons and bolters fired in unison, suppressing the enemy, stabilizing their line. The officer moved through the chaos, guiding squads, directing fire, shielding the wounded. Each soldier was an instrument in a carefully orchestrated defense, ordinary humans performing extraordinary feats. At the deepest point of the tunnels, the officer observed a massive warp node, pulsating with energy that made the air shimmer and burn. The cultists were attempting to channel this raw power into a ritual, a weapon capable of tearing the city apart. The regiment could not allow it. "Destroy the node," the officer commanded. Squads coordinated, firing in perfect unison. The warp node shuddered, sparks of energy arcing wildly, threatening to tear reality itself. Soldiers dodged, fired, advanced, and pressed forward. Ordinary humans, fragile and fleeting, battled against forces of unimaginable corruption. Finally, the warp node collapsed, a flash of blinding light followed by a ringing silence. The tunnels shook, and the enemy scattered into the shadows. The regiment had succeeded, but the officer knew this was only temporary. Chaos was patient. It would return. The regiment emerged from the tunnels at dawn, weary, battered, yet alive. Soldiers tended to wounds, repaired equipment, and reinforced positions. The officer surveyed the horizon. The city was scarred, the battle far from over, but humanity had survived another night. Ordinary humans standing against the unimaginable had endured. They were fragile, yes, but unbreakable in their determination. They were a testament to courage, discipline, and the unwavering will to survive. Because that was what it meant to be human. Because that was what it meant to be a guardsman. Because they would hold the line. Always. The dawn broke dimly over Veros Theta, heavy clouds smothering the sun in a blanket of gray. The city lay scarred, streets littered with rubble, smoke rising in thin columns from distant fires. The regiment had survived the subterranean horrors, yet the enemy was far from finished. Ordinary humans, fragile and mortal, were about to face the full force of a coordinated assault. The officer stepped onto a shattered balcony, surveying the city below. Movement stirred in every ruined street, cultists regrouping, demons prowling, and war machines lumbering into position. The enemy had learned, adapted, and now struck as one. The officer's jaw tightened. "Prepare the line," he commanded. "Every street, every building, every choke point must be defended. We will not fall. Squads moved with precision, bolters and lagoons ready, barricades reinforced, every soldier understanding the critical balance between caution and action. Ordinary humans were fragile, yes, but discipline and unity turned them into a force capable of withstanding unimaginable odds. The first wave struck suddenly. From the ruins, cultists surged with unholy fervor, flanked by warp-twisted beasts and demons that seemed to bleed from reality itself. Lagoons and bolters flared, volley after coordinated volley driving the enemy back, step by step. The regiment held firm, ordinary humans against extraordinary horrors. The officer moved along the line, chain sword in one hand, lost pistol in the other, guiding squads, reinforcing weak points, shielding the wounded. Every movement was calculated, every decision critical. Fear existed, but it was harnessed, shaped into focus and resolve. A massive demon broke through a barricade, towering above the regiment, its claws dripping warp energy. Soldiers fired relentlessly, but some fell under its blows. The medic moved through the chaos, stabilizing the wounded, her hands steady, her presence a quiet beacon of hope amid carnage. Hold! Fire together! Do not break! The officer shouted. Squads responded instantly, coordinated volleys striking the demon with precision. It staggered, letting the regiment push forward, reclaiming the street inch by inch. Ordinary humans pressed against the impossible, every shot, every step, and every heartbeat a defiance of the darkness. Hours passed as waves continued to assault the regiment's positions. Smoke and ash blurred vision. Fire painted the city in flickering shadows, yet the Astra Militarism held. Ordinary humans, fragile and fallible, endured against demonic horror and cultist fanaticism alike. A war machine, twisted and alive with warp energy, advanced through the central plaza. The officer observed, calculating. He signaled a coordinated strike. 2 squads would flank from the east, bolters synchronized with lagoon fire. Precision over brute force. Every soldier understood, every shot counted. The flanking squads moved with silent determination. Bolters thundered, lagoons flared, and the war machine shuddered under the combined fire. Sparks flew, metal twisted, and with one final coordinated strike, the enemy collapsed. The street fell silent for a heartbeat before the next wave surged. Night approached, shrouding the city in darkness once more. Fires burned across the ruins, casting long, flickering shadows. The regiment huddled in fortified positions, tending to wounds, checking ammunition, and reinforcing barricades. Faces were pale, bodies battered, yet the will to survive burned brighter than any fire. The officer moved among them, speaking quietly to squads. We have held the line today. We have survived what should have broken us. But the war is far from over. Remember this, humanity endures because we endure. We hold and we survive. In the shadows beyond, whispers of the warp pulsed faintly, subtle but unmistakable. The enemy was retreating, reorganizing, plotting, but they would return. The Astra Militarism would face them again, ordinary humans standing as the bulwark against chaos. As the regiment rested for the night, torches flickering against ruined walls, soldiers whispered quiet prayers, shared water and rations, and offered comforting words. Even in exhaustion and fear, humanity persisted. Every breath, every heartbeat was a testament to resilience, courage, and unbroken will. The officer looked over the city one last time before night fully claimed it. The streets were scarred, the enemy wounded but not destroyed, and the regiment weary but unbroken. Ordinary humans, fragile yet steadfast, had faced an overwhelming siege and endured. They would wake again to fight. They would march again. They would survive again, because that was what it meant to be human, because that was what it meant to be a guardsman, because they would hold the line, always. The first rays of dawn cut through the smoke of Veros Theta, illuminating the battered city with pale, gray light. The regiment had endured wave after wave of chaos, yet the enemy remained. The officer surveyed the streets from a reinforced barricade, chain sword in one hand, lost pistol in the other. Ordinary humans, fragile and mortal, were about to rise for a final push, reclaiming what had been torn from them. "Today we take the fight to them," the officer said quietly. "Every street we reclaim, every building we secure, is a strike for humanity. We hold nothing back." Squads moved into position, coordinating with precision. Bolters clicked, lagoons charged, and every soldier understood the stakes. Ordinary humans, ordinary flesh and bone, were about to become the hammer against a tide of demonic and cultist terror. The first wave of the counteroffensive surged through the ruins. Bolters roared, lagoons flared, and soldiers pressed forward, reclaiming streets block by block. Every step was hard-earned. Every inch of ground was paid for in sweat, blood, and determination. The enemy, taken off guard, faltered in their advance. Chaos, once relentless, now reacted, attempting to stabilize their positions. The officer moved among the squads, correcting fire, reinforcing barricades, shielding the wounded. Every movement was deliberate, precise, and necessary. Ordinary humans, exhausted and battered, pressed on with relentless determination. Fear existed, yes, but it was harnessed into discipline and resolve. In the central plaza, the war machine that had terrorized the regiment earlier stirred once more, repaired by cultist engineers and fueled with warp energy. The officer signaled a coordinated strike. Squads flanking from east and west, precision volleys timed with bolter fire. The flanking squads advanced with silent focus. Bolters thundered, lagoons streaked the air, and the war machine shuddered under combined fire. Sparks flew, metal twisted, and with one final, unified strike, the construct collapsed into rubble. Soldiers cheered quietly, keeping their focus on the next objective. Ordinary humans had overcome extraordinary force. Beyond the plaza, the cathedral still pulsed faintly with warp energy, a reminder of the corruption embedded deep in the city. The officer knew this was the source of the cultists' renewed strength. Ordinary humans, ordinary soldiers, would now face the heart of the enemy's influence. Squads moved in coordinated formations, clearing streets, buildings, and alleys. Every engagement was brutal but precise, every soldier a cog in the regiment's disciplined advance. The medic continued her quiet work, stabilizing the wounded, tending burns, and offering words of encouragement. Every life preserved was another link in the chain holding humanity's line. The officer led the final approach to the cathedral. Warp energy shimmered through shattered windows, shadows flickering unnaturally along the walls. Cultists gathered in desperate formations, demons lurking in the corners, and a low hum of power vibrated through the structure. Ordinary humans prepared to face forces beyond comprehension. "This is the heart of their corruption," the officer whispered. "We end it here, together." The regiment surged forward, bolters and lagoons firing in unison. Smoke and sparks filled the air as they advanced through shattered corridors. Demons lunged from shadows, cultists cried prayers to impossible gods, and the Astra Militarism pressed forward without hesitation. Hours passed in relentless engagement. Ordinary humans moved with uncanny precision and endurance, every shot calculated, every step deliberate. Warp energy crackled, shadows twisted unnaturally, and the cathedral itself seemed alive with malevolence. Yet the regiment endured, a wall of flesh and will against the impossible. Finally, they reached the central altar. The officer observed the ritual taking place. A massive warp node, its energy pulsating and distorting reality. Cultists chanted in unison, feeding power into it. The demon presence was strongest here, clawing at reality itself. "Destroy the node," the officer commanded. Squads coordinated, firing in perfect synchrony. Bolters and lagoons tore at the node, destabilizing it. Sparks and energy arcs danced through the chamber. The warp node shuddered violently, then exploded in a blinding flash of light. Shadows screamed as the warp energy collapsed in on itself. Ordinary humans, fragile and fallible, had struck a decisive blow against impossible forces. Silence followed, heavy and complete, broken only by the faint crackle of collapsing ruins. Soldiers gathered, breathing hard, bodies battered, yet spirits unbroken. The cathedral, once a conduit for chaos, now lay in ruins, purified by fire and determination. The officer surveyed the battlefield. Every street reclaimed, every enemy neutralized, every life preserved was a testament to human resilience. Ordinary humans, standing against chaos incarnate, had endured and prevailed. As dusk fell, the regiment regrouped, reinforcing positions, tending wounds, and preparing for the next day. The city was scarred, yet humanity remained. Every soldier, every human in that regiment, had proven that ordinary people could face the extraordinary and endure, because that was what it meant to be human, because that was what it meant to be a guardsman, because they would hold the line, always. The city of Veros Theta lay in silence, broken only by the distant crackle of smoldering fires. The regiment had reclaimed the streets, purged the cathedral, and defeated the immediate threat of cultists and demons. Yet silence in a city scarred by warp corruption was uneasy, heavy with the promise of further danger. Ordinary humans, fragile in the grand scheme of the galaxy, had endured. The officer stood atop a battered parapet, surveying the ruined city. Buildings were shattered, streets littered with debris, and smoke curled from the remains of warp-fueled explosions. Soldiers moved methodically through the ruins, checking positions, stabilizing the wounded, and securing the area. Every step was deliberate, every breath a quiet act of defiance. "Regroup," the officer commanded. "Check every corner, every ruin. We cannot assume the enemy is gone." Squads moved with precision, bolters clicking, lagoons charging. Ordinary humans, trained and disciplined, were the bulwark against chaos incarnate. They moved through the city like shadows, clearing ruins, securing barricades, and ensuring the safety of their comrades. In the cathedral, the altar lay in ruins, the warp node destroyed. The officer stepped carefully through the debris, observing the remnants of the ritual. Shadows twisted unnaturally around the broken walls, but the energy had been purged. The demon presences that had haunted the city recoiled, retreating into the immaterial. Yet the officer knew this victory was temporary. Chaos was patient, relentless, and infinite. He turned to his regiment, weary but unbroken. Soldiers tended to wounds, checked ammunition, and whispered quiet prayers. The medic moved among them, stabilizing the gravely injured, her hands steady despite exhaustion. Each life saved, each soldier standing, was a testament to humanity's enduring spirit. The officer's gaze fell on the horizon. Smoke rose from distant parts of the city, faint shapes moving in the haze. Cultists, war machines, remnants of chaos. They had not been completely eradicated. But for now, the regiment had carved a fragile peace, a moment of reprieve to gather strength. "Rest where you can," he said quietly. "We have survived what should have destroyed us, but tomorrow we remain vigilant. Humanity endures, and so must we." Night fell fully, blanketing Veros Theta in darkness. Fires flickered along the streets, casting long, dancing shadows. Soldiers found temporary shelter in ruined buildings, sharing what little rations remained, offering comforting words to the wounded, and whispering prayers for those who would not rise again. Ordinary humans, fragile and mortal, had survived, yet their endurance was as much mental as physical. The officer walked among his squads, quietly checking each position. Every soldier bore scars of battle, yet the line held. Every life preserved, every step forward taken, was a victory against forces beyond comprehension. The city had been scarred, but humanity had endured. He paused at the city walls, gazing outward into the darkness. Beyond the ruins, the warp hummed faintly, a low, persistent resonance that promised the return of chaos. The officer's jaw tightened. The regiment had survived this night, but vigilance would always be necessary. Ordinary humans, despite their fragility, were the guardians of humanity's line. A distant howl echoed across the city, a reminder that predators still lurked, that the night was never truly safe, that the galaxy itself was a hostile and uncaring expanse. Soldiers flinched at the sound but continued their work. Courage was not the absence of fear, the officer reminded himself. Courage was moving forward despite it. The regiment established watch rotations, ensuring that no shadow went unmonitored, no sound unheeded. Ordinary humans, fragile yet disciplined, became the guardians of the fragile peace they had carved from chaos. They were the wall against the storm, a testament to endurance and unity. Hours passed. Soldiers slept fitfully, armor and weapons at the ready, eyes flickering open at the faintest movement. The officer took his place at the highest vantage point, chain sword resting across his knees, eyes scanning the horizon. Humanity endured because of their vigilance. Humanity endured because ordinary humans refused to yield. As dawn approached once more, light spilled weakly over Veros Theta. The city remained in ruins, yet the regiment stood unbroken. Ordinary humans against impossible odds had survived. They had faced chaos incarnate, demons, cultists, and warp corruption, and endured. The officer lowered his chain's word, his voice a quiet murmur to himself, to his soldiers, to the void. This city, this line, humanity, it survives because we endure. We hold, we fight, and we do not yield. The darkness may return, but so shall we, steadfast, unbroken, and unwavering. The regiment stood silent yet resolute. The night was over, yet vigilance remained eternal. Ordinary humans, fragile and fleeting, had stood against the impossible and carved a victory that was hard-won and ephemeral. The scars of battle would remain, but so would the will to endure, because that was what it meant to be human, because that was what it meant to be a guardsman, because they would hold the line, always,